Hello, and welcome to this episode of Dr. K's Psychobabble, our continued discussion of the topic of intelligence. And as it said in the title, we're going to talk about intelligence and culture today. Culture plays a part in this all along, and this is not the complete discussion of the relationship between culture and intelligence. We'll be getting into that when we look at some of the areas of multiple intelligence that try to take that into consideration. But we're going to look at a particular time in history where interesting and controversial thoughts about the concept of intelligence arose here in the United States. So before I talk about the United States, let's talk about France again. So we understand from the previous discussions on intelligence that Alfred Binet created the test in France, and we talked about that being context specific, meaning his IQ test, or his development of the mental age, was specifically geared toward the context of school. Now, in this discussion, what we want to really realize that in fact context is not necessarily the best word. Culture is the best word. It's more specific. IQ is culture specific, meaning that what IQ means for an individual has to do with the totality of the environment, family, norms, values, expectations, all of that have an impact on intelligence as it's defined within that culture. And we'll certainly get into that a little bit later. This, however, created some really, the idea and the knowledge, the fact that IQ tests are culture specific ended up creating some pretty controversial issues. And we'll get into that right now. So IQ is culture specific. We have Terman's efforts in terms of eugenics, obviously, huge fail. But not too long after that, a book came out, a very controversial book that I learned about early in my college career as my computer decided to flip out a little bit. And that was the book, The Bell Curve. This was published in 1994 and created quite a stir. So let's take a look at what happened, the assumptions and the conclusions that were drawn by this particular book that took a look at intelligence and the concepts of race and ethnicity. Now, the assumptions that were made by the authors of the Bell Curve were that there is a general factor, G, where individuals differ. Now, you can remember this right from the first video where that there's a single component measurable that is intelligence. And that was an assumption that was made by these authors when they were looking at the data that they were gathering. IQ tests, specifically designed, is the best way to measure this. Now, there's in the longer assumption, it says all academic tests test intelligence. However, IQ tests test it the best. So if you think about, a spelling test or a research paper or something, all of those, in a way, are measures of intelligence. Now, keep in mind, they're saying academic tests. So we're still very, very nestled in that notion of school being the context in which we are measuring the skills that are most adaptive to the school environment. And I'm going to present to you that the school represents a unique culture with unique values, unique expectations, and unique standards of behavior, norms. Okay, so we're still in that world here. IQ tests measure this factor the best. IQ means what most people mean when they say a person is intelligent or smart. When we use that language, their assumption is this is what people are talking about. They're talking about this set of skills specifically to the school context / culture. IQ is mostly stable across the lifespan, which implicitly infers that we're born with it. There's a highly genetic component, high heritability, sorry, that's the real phrase for that. A high heritability factor. And we're going to see that that's sort of the place where we get a little bit controversial here. IQ tests, when properly administered and scored, are not biased. And we're going to find out that that really didn't turn out so well. And IQ is largely inherited. And that kind of repeat how much of that, the implicit assumption that is made from IQ being assumed to be stable across the lifespan. Now, first of all, let's take a chance to take a look at 3 of these that I think are actually sort of on the chopping block based on more recent research. I put these here and we look at, does IQ really represent what most people talk about when they talk about intelligence? And I'm going to tell you that now this is anecdotal, but in my psychology class, when we talk about intelligence, I often ask, who's the most intelligent person you know? And the individuals will talk about, and I'll say, well, what makes them the most intelligent person that you know? And we find out that really there's quite a diversity of reasons why somebody is the most intelligent person that they know. Maybe it's their problem-solving skills, or maybe they just seem wise and they have good answers for social problems and life challenges. Or they may be book smart. They may have lots of degrees. They may be doctors or lawyers or something based on their social role. All of these, but it's almost, I don't think there's ever really been an instance in which somebody said specifically because they have a high IQ, and maybe less often, because they did really well in school. And almost always, when somebody talks about somebody doing really well in school, there's often that anecdotal thing that comes along that says, well, they're really book smart, but they can't get themselves out of the paper bag. The common sense part is missing. Like that would be that those 2 things are disconnected, which they really are not. Those are characteristics of the personality that are not necessarily associated with intelligence. So this notion that most people are referring to the skill set and adaptability to do well in school as intelligent or smart has some basis in reality, but it's definitely not the only way in which we think about intelligence. That IQ tests properly administered and scored are not biased. This has actually been shown to be not the case in the literature. That, keeping in mind the idea of the way that we've been raised, let's say that, and I'll get to this right at the end, the school environment, let's say, even when we're looking at those kinds of skills, not all schools are created equally, not all schools produce the same results. Therefore, that environmental factor is different, and then that person's cultural upbringing is different, and therefore they may be well or not well prepared for doing well on this test. Okay? Now, keeping in mind, we're still remaining that IQ is specifically for school. They're generalizing that it's really what everybody's talking about and that it's not biased, it's measuring this, ability, whatnot, and we recognize that that's really not the case. And finally, that IQ is largely inherited, which there is a heritability factor. I believe right now the general assumption is that it's about 50-50. Right now, about 50%. Now, this is done statistically. This isn't done by tracing like, oh, here's the intelligence gene and this is how it expresses itself. This is done statistically, looking at families and they find out it's about 50% of our performance on tests that measure our abilities and adaptability to school environments, IQ, is related to our genetics, or can be traced through genetics, about 50% related to environment. So the environment / culture is playing a really huge role. Now, let me throw it at you. So far, you're like, okay, well, what's wrong with this book? Well, what happened with this book is when they published all of these assumptions and whatnot, and the data that they collected, they drew conclusions based upon racial lines that persons of African American descent were genetically inferior. Remember, the assumption is that intelligence is inherited. So this group, which in reality performed less well than their white peers, must be genetically inferior. Asians, slightly less, are slightly inferior. Now, these were logical conclusions to draw based upon these assumptions, and these are not necessarily racially driven authors. They were simply reporting what they saw, but we can see the error arising in the assumptions that they made. Now, I entered college, and this, interestingly enough, was still a hot topic. Okay? I graduated in '83, and I then went into college, and then into graduate school. And in graduate school, this book came out. And it created quite a stir. That here was evidence validating for many people their personal perceptions that the races were different in this way. Now, I remember, and I'm going to throw this out here only because it's a little experience that I had, and I'm proud to say I thought it was rather ridiculous. I can see the bare bones logic of it, but it again doesn't make any sense. I remember a professor, not their own viewpoint. It wasn't their viewpoint. They were expressing a viewpoint that had been published, that the reason why African American population in the United States was inferior intellectually to whites was because in the slave trade, when the slave traders went to Africa and were essentially hunting slaves, they captured the weak ones. They captured the ones that were not intelligent enough to get away. So there was individuals that said it's nothing about the race. It's about this selection of the least intelligent, least adaptive, least fast, least evading individuals. They're the ones that got caught. So that group came to America, and therefore that was sort of like the bottom of the gene pool. This was actually published. So this kind of, and I've got to say, when you look at it in the pure logic, you're like, I can see where someone can put that line together, but wow, this is really way over the line in terms of the kinds of assumptions that we would make about, first, the importance of genetics, and second, that this is the causal factor of the differences that we see, multiple generations later. And so quite a reach in terms of the assumptions made on that. So along in this book, now this book was not only an examination of the statistics that they had found, but also of where we're going if this keeps on going. Predictions of doom and gloom for the United States. And they predicted in this book that first there would be an emergence and isolation of the cognitive elite, mostly white, that they would isolate themselves, they would sequester themselves in communities, they would sequester themselves in universities to separate themselves from the lower class. Pro-social behavior, closely aligned with high intelligence, would increasingly become the domain of the elite, and other racial groups would descend into antisocial behavior, that the overall IQ would decrease because the lower echelon of our society is reproducing more than the elites. The elites are not having as many children, and the non-elites are having lots of children. And this would increasingly develop dependence of a larger and larger population on the state, creating what they call a welfare state. Let me just let that sink in for a little bit here. Let's ask ourselves, where do we see this in our current political and economic and media climate? Media, I meant media, not medial. Media climate. Where do we see this now? Now, first of all, a little piece of history here. During Ellis Island immigration, when individuals were given IQ tests in English, which they didn't understand, and individuals who were unlucky enough to speak English or unable to navigate that particular test were considered to be idiots, imbeciles, and morons, and were sometimes institutionalized because of that. Because there was a period of time in which there was we went through not me, but people went through the institutions and found people that didn't understand English. That was the only thing that made that person diagnosed as a person who is unintelligent. See, that just really, really horrible things that happened. This is also the origin of the relationship that we have between the vocalizations, the behavior, and the measures of intelligence associated with deaf people. Now, deaf people coming over, even if they understood English, even whatever, would generally not do well on any of the questions that were being asked in terms of intelligence, and their vocalizations would have the hollowed out sound of an individual who learned to vocalize without the ability to hear. And that talking is like this. Now, when you're speaking out loud with a person who's deaf, that hollow kind of vocalization is because they have never been able to monitor their own hearing and thus have the nuances of fluctuation in tone and volume that we have. That was, at Ellis Island, and certainly for years beyond that, considered a sign of low intellect, which has now translated into the diagnosis of deaf and dumb. Deaf in the sign language is deaf and dumb. A person will refer to themselves as deaf and dumb. Dumb is the word for I can't speak. But dumb became the word for someone who's not smart. And the vocalization of a typical person who's deaf became the way someone would act out. Now, think about, I've done it. Many of you have done it. We've used that vocalization to portray someone who's unintelligent when in fact we're portraying someone who's deaf, not necessarily unintelligent. So some of this came out about these early days of applications of these things. It's kind of horrible. So there's that. And one more statement. There was this is not that old, but when I first went to college, I was my first girlfriend there, Lisa, was deaf. And she was extremely hard of hearing, very similar to my hearing loss. And she wore hearing aids and whatnot. And as I got to know her, I learned that she spent the first 5 years of her life in a mental institution, being diagnosed as mentally retarded, when in fact she was deaf. And her lack of response to the hearing world, even at that time, she was my age, born in 1965. At that time, she was diagnosed as being mentally deficient, mentally retarded, and put in an institution. Not that long ago that those assumptions were made. Thankfully, science has brought us much further than that. So that's a little bit about the history about that. Those, where do we see these in the current political climate? Let's say what current fears related to immigration, that these individuals coming into our country are somehow less than because they're not, culturally the same as us. We have an anti-intellectualism, which is very interesting, versus common sense. This is the common sense component is seen as superior to intellectualism as a way to kind of get people to buy in to a particular political movement. This is populism. Basically, the idea that it's actually pointing out the elite who may or may not, say the intelligentsia, people in academia or physicians or whatever, and pointing those individuals out as being really book smart, but they don't really understand the way the world works and stuff. And we should, almost in line with this, we should make sure that those individuals are not in charge, and just regular folks should be in charge. And it's bizarre. It's bizarre. And so we have populism coming up, the anti-intellectualism versus the common sense, the common person and their understanding of the world. And the poor themselves have become the enemy, not poverty. Poverty does not check your IQ before it descends upon you. Issues regarding race and ethnicity, and ultimately anti-socialism, anti-intervention, anti-programs related to addressing poverty. If the problem is the poor person and they're just not quote unquote smart enough to get out of their situation, then they deserve to be the way they are. This is a political message. This is a political ethic. And so any effort from that logical standpoint, just purely logic, any effort to change that through social programs would be futile because it's genetic. And it's not taken into consideration, certainly, the notion that, and it's 50-50 right now, but some will argue that it's even that the environment plays an even more significant role in terms of outcomes and whatnot in person's success. And again, we're still just talking about IQ and school. Now, the realities are there were differences between the races, and that indicated that schools were different, cultures were different, and then maybe some schools underfunded or were not preparing individuals well for the environments in which they wanted to be successful. The Flint Effect is the argument within the literature that the environment trumps genetics. That even if there is, and there is a genetic component to IQ, even so, we can beat that with the right environment and the right education. What are the interventions? School funding, equity, targeting areas that are low performing. I mean, certainly efforts like No Child Left Behind were pro-social efforts. Probably a good idea with a poor implementation. That's how I've always sort of interpreted that. But certainly a recognition that schools should be held accountable for preparing individuals for wherever and whatever environment they're going to go into. And I'm going to go a little bit into that. What is the relationship between preparatory places and performance places? That's kind of how I made up a way to talk about those things. We'll look at interventions. IQ, and this is the big one for me as a psychologist, IQ is not the only measure of human excellence. We continue to this day think that this is the be-all, end-all, and it is not. And finally, we need more inclusive definitions of intelligence, and those need to become more pervasive. And certainly, along the lines in this. We're going to be getting into some of those in the next few videos, looking at multiple intelligence theories that move away from that single factor G. The G factor still exists. In fact, in each one of these, there's a reference to IQ. And where does it fit into the variety of ways in which we measure intelligence and what we mean by that? Okay. So here's what I think. There are preparatory cultures. And I'm going to, rather than looking at them as institutions, I'm going to say that each institution, a school, a family, or whatever, is a preparatory culture. It's the thing that we're exposed to that teaches us for the next step. So family, let's say, is a preparatory culture that gives us the skills and knowledge that we need to do well in the world. And the degree to which that particular family unit is able to do that is the degree to which that particular family unit is functional or not functional. So the idea of a dysfunctional family has less to do with the presence of some particular challenge, such as poverty or mental illness or alcoholism or anything like that. And it has more to do with, does that family unit have the ability to impress upon their children the skills, knowledge that they need to do well in the world? And we can look at all institutions and we can examine the actual, in sociology, we call the process of that transmission of information socialization, and what they're transmitting is the culture of that family. So cultural transmission from one unit to an individual is called socialization. So I'm taking that language, I'm going to say there are units that prepare, their culture prepares for the next culture that they're going to go to. So we have the family, school, college, work, training program, whatever, is that thing preparing you for the next step. So here we have the preparatory culture feeds and provides what individuals need to be in the performance culture, the place where they're going to be, the next step, let's say. So we can look, for example, we can look at high school as a preparatory culture for college. So does the high school prepare and give individuals what they need to enter into college and the minimal expectations that you have in college? So that's a question to be asked. Other areas and college itself is a preparatory culture, maybe to work, and both being a preparatory culture for the civic life, engaging in life and doing things, all this. To what degree do our preparatory cultures actually prepare us to perform? Now, if there's a mismatch between the cultures, the culture of the preparatory and the culture of the performance are not in line, then individuals will enter into their unprepared. And I believe there may be trends when we look at poverty, when we look at racial disparity, when we look at discrimination, we look at all those things, that those create real and very tangible barriers for individuals to be prepared for the culture in which they're going into. So if you went to a really deprived school, you may have graduated, but you may have not graduated with the skill set that's being expected of you when you go into college. So as unfair as that is, the IQ test that you would take is actually, in a way, without getting into, the assumption about individuals and their groups that they come from, but the IQ test is actually accurate to the point that if you're not prepared for what's there and you have a test that measures what you need to be good in that environment, then the test is valid. The test is truly pointing out a discrepancy between your preparedness and your ability to be successful in that environment. We call it IQ, and we put too much into IQ because we forget that it's just about school and not the only measure of human excellence. But nonetheless, in that one environment, in that one area, we see the reality of the IQ coming, and it should inform us not to discredit the environment from which somebody came from, or the racial group, or the ethnic group that individual came from, but for remediation. I work at a community college, and we have individuals in a mostly white state coming in not prepared for college, and we remediate that. At the same time, we may advocate for changes in the high school to better prepare individuals for that, to lower the need for remediation, which is fine to do, but it does delay someone's completion of their training and entry into the workforce. So there's a kind of a cost for remediation when our expectation that the preparatory environment would provide the individual with the skills. I'd imagine that is the issue, that's the core issue going on all over the place. So, often, however, the preparatory culture seeks to change the performance culture in a way. And I know that I throw this in here because we try to teach here at the college, let's say, evidence-based best practice versus what's going on in the environment, what's going on out in the workplace. And this has come up as sort of an interesting argument about if, let's say, when I was running the mental health program, we adopted new guidelines that were just beginning to make their way out into the field of where people were actually practicing. So our students were coming out of the college with a set of norms, values, and expectation, the culture of mental health that was right on the, let's say, the bleeding edge, entering into agencies that were not on the bleeding edge. So the students, in terms of the progression of our knowledge, were ahead of the places that we're going in. So we run that risk too. We run the risk of creating expectations in our students that are more advanced or at the next level than an organization's, the performance culture, and those individuals would arrive somewhat unprepared. And this might, one of the arguments for internships and experiential learning and whatnot is to be able to bridge that gap, to understand, okay, here's the ideal, here's the practice, and I'm gonna rest assured that curriculum is easier to change than the culture of an organization. So when those new standards came along, switch, we were right there. Organizations take a little bit longer in order to change the way people see things, even in small ways. It's sometimes difficult. Sometimes it's, inherent in the paperwork. They'll be behind because the paperwork itself hasn't been updated, that kind of thing. So always that, again, that idea that the preparatory culture is there to prepare individuals for the next culture. And go to my next slide here. What we have is the need for a reciprocal relationship between the preparatory cultures and the performance. And we're going to put all of those in there. All the preparatory cultures, be it family, church, the military, the schools, obviously, and all of these in terms of the performance culture, there should be this reciprocal relationship, communicating with each other. That just as I was saying that, I said the military, and I have had numerous conversations with individuals who are now going to KVCC who were in the military, performed well in the military, transitioned back into civilian life and going to college, and lament about how they were not prepared for their re-entry into civilian life, that wasn't part of the curriculum of the military, and that has long been not the part of the military. When aside from problems coming up, an individual being discharged is basically moving on to a different job, but yet the movement from military life to civilian life probably entails a lot more change than a regular job change. And it's probably important for the military to create more processes in order to establish that ability, let alone establishing a connection between what those individuals did in the military and its marketable value in civilian life. Basically, should they get credit for that, on toward their college or something like that? So here we have this ideal situation of the preparatory culture and performance culture communicating with each other and creating a situation that we assure preparedness and adaptive to cultural economic changes that occur. So the performance culture informs the preparatory culture informs the performance culture, and we have the ability for both to adapt to changes that are occurring. Okay, so that was a little bit about culture and intelligence. In the next segment here, we're going to go into a little bit in testing and measurement and looking at the fallacies and reliabilities within testing for intelligence. And then soon after that, we'll be entering into the new and emerging field of multiple intelligence. So until then, have a great week.